Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this month's edition of Side by Side Digital. I'm your host, Rebecca Shively. This month, we have balance sheets on the brain as we're heading towards the end of the year. We have two of our experts here to answer your questions and guide us through some best practices when it comes to building your balance sheet. And now I'll turn it over to our experts. Nick Bauer is a financial services officer serving Southeast Nebraska, and Kevin Hicks is a credit operations analyst in our Omaha office. And I want to thank Kevin and Nick for being here. And with that, I'll turn it over to you guys.
Well, I'd also like to welcome you to our balance sheet best practices. I think that balance sheets are a critical part of our operations. And I think that the fact that you're here joining us today to learn about these balance sheets and probably what is some pretty good weather where you're at tells us something about how important that balance sheets are to you, and that you recognize how important they are to their operations. So I want to take a second thank you to say that, your commitment to your operation says a lot, and hopefully you will get something out of our presentation today. So what is a balance sheet? Our balance sheets reflect our assets and liabilities. They're really a reflection of the health of your operation. If we think about a balance sheet reflects those assets and liabilities as snapshot on a particular day. That tells us a lot about what's happened in the operation up to that point. The slide talks about changes over time. If we think about a balance sheet as being one part of the financial statements that you prepare in the normal course of your operation, we would have the balance sheet, we would have an income statement, and you may have a cash flow. The balance sheet's that snapshot. The income statement kind of tells us about the journey you take between those snapshots. And so what's important to us about that balance sheet is it's kind of almost like getting a checkup with your doctor. It tells us what's changed, how are you doing? Those visits with your doctor, it might be, what's your cholesterol count, or what's your weight, or, how is this working out for you? How is that working out? And your balance sheet's not much different. We're going to look at those balance sheets, and it's going to give us an insight into how have things progressed, or what challenges you may have had, from one year to the next.
And to build on that, what Kevin just told you is that third bullet tells how your operation is changing over time. One thing to try to be consistent with is completing a balance sheet at around the same time every year. Just to use a grain operation as an example, try to do it post harvest when the bushels are in the bin, or they're when they're stored, but not when they're out in the field, because the information can be so much more accurate, and it'll provide you more value as well.
Absolutely, Nick. And just like if you have a cow calf operation, we'd be looking for when you have calves on the ground. It gives us a better idea about how things are going. Remember that since that balance sheet really is a reflection of your operation, take that balance sheet at a time that's good for you. Don't do it in a pre-harvest if you can wait until post-harvest.
Real quick, Kevin, if I could also just point out again how it's changing over time. Do that balance sheet consistently the same time period. And then when you look at the end result every year, it's going to kind of point you in the direction your operation's moving. Are you building equity? Are you building liquid reserves? It's kind of like the scoreboard in agriculture, if you will. The results of that balance sheet from one year to the next is kind of telling you, are you winning, or do you need to make some adjustments heading into the next year?
So like we talked about, these are the big three, but for us, I would say the balance sheet probably tells us more about an operation than either of the other two do. Together, they're fantastic to have as a unit, but that balance sheet is really important. You can see here, when we talk about assets, liabilities, we generally at Farm Credit break them down into current and non-current categories. You may deal with other banks that use other terminology, but basically current is going to be anything that you can convert in 12 months. And when we say convert, it's either going to be converted into cash and or consumed by the operation. So any prepaids that you may have, seed, chemicals, fuel, those types of things are going to be current. And then your non-current assets and liabilities are those things assets that you're holding on to for more than 12 months, or those liabilities that are going to be paid back over a longer length of time.
And one thing I try to advise customers on when you're putting this together, keep in mind, we're going to ask you a lot of questions when we're building this balance sheet. We're not asking those questions because we're trying to determine what we're going to use as collateral for your loan. We just want to make sure we accurately reflect what you've built over time, what your operation truly consists of. So, some people might have a tendency to not list everything, but I would advise you to list everything you've acquired, because it helps tell the story of your business.
Absolutely. Here we have kind of a generic, really basic balance sheet setup. And these are some of the categories that we use at Farm Credit. So if we look at what's in our current assets here, cash is going to be things like your checking and savings accounts. So really think about, are you reflecting personal accounts? Do you have a separate account possibly for a farm operation or entity? Marketable bonds and securities. These are usually stocks and bonds. Typically, if we're going to have them in current, we're not looking at them as retirement accounts or some type of saving or long-term investment that you're using for other purposes. If we're showing them up in current assets, we would hope that they are those types of investments that you would be willing to liquidate if need be, or that are easily liquidatable. This is one that, Nick, I'll let you chime in here too, this is probably one of those that, you really need to share with your financial officers when you're making your balance sheets and come to an understanding about what the purpose of these types of accounts are.
Exactly, Kevin. I like to think of, if you look at the non-current assets, that's kind of the factory, if you will. Those are the assets that you are going to use year in and year out to help produce the widgets that you're going to sell, which are more your current assets. And when you're going through those, again, be as detailed as possible. For instance, if you're going through crop inventory and you have so many bushels sold at X price, or you have a basis contract on so many bushels, let us know that. Because otherwise we're going to value things as of the market, as of the date of that statement. But if you did some good pre-selling, let's itemize that out so it reflects some of those good decisions you made throughout the year. On some of your receivables, if you're still owed some money for maybe some custom work you did, let's make sure we include that, because that's money that'll be coming in the next 6 to 12 months.
Absolutely. And on the note about accounts receivable, do you have rent checks that are coming in? And remember that we want to look at your operation holistically. If you have maybe a rental property, a rental house that you have some rent checks coming in from, be sure to include those, because we want to look at the whole and not just one part of that operation.
Another thing to keep in mind is I've had examples where customers will come in to complete their balance sheet, and before they come back to my office, they'll bring a check in to put against their line of credit. Make sure you tell your officer that you did that, because when your officer pulls your account balance, it might not reflect that you brought in 10,000 of grain checks. So make sure that gets accurately reflected, whether it's on your line of credit balance or a receivable that you did just bring in. So just a kind of a tip I've learned over the years.
The commodity trading accounts. So if you have any type of hedging account, we'd like you to be sure to share that with us as well. Nick kind of talked about market livestock and feed and grain inventories, and I would absolutely second, what he has said is be sure to let us know if you have contracted prices on those, and make sure that you're getting, as accurate as possible with the numbers that you're providing us, whether it's quantity or pricing. Prepaids, again, be sure that you're capturing everything. And I guess the biggest kind of takeaway, particularly with current assets, is detailed record keeping. Don't try to, the night before a meeting with your financial officer, throw together a balance sheet. Is a good quality balance sheet. You're essentially, as part of your normal record keeping, you should be monitoring most of these things. And so, don't try to just put together these numbers overnight.
That's a very good point. I mean, you should really focus on this really throughout the year, to be quite honest. This shouldn't be a one-time a year project that you just try to slap together at 10 p.m. before your 8:30 meeting tomorrow.
It doesn't work for cramming for a test, and it doesn't work for cramming for a balance sheet, basically.
Yep.
Investment in growing crops. So if you happen particularly to take a balance sheet at a time of year where, you may have crop planted in the ground, you haven't harvested yet, be sure to capture those cash inputs that you already have in the field, because, otherwise you're going to be missing that part of your current assets, and you more likely than not have a current liability that's already on your balance sheet reflecting those purchases. So be sure to capture those. If we look at non-current assets, for the bulk, I would absolutely agree with Nick about his analogy that these are your factory pieces. So, this is the machinery and equipment, vehicles, everything that goes into producing whatever it is that is your operation. For the big one, I think, between vehicles and machinery and equipment, we see a lot of people who will include semi-tractors and semi-trailers in their vehicle lists. Those do belong, in their machinery and equipment list. They do belong in vehicles. Generally, anything that has a title, we're going to put in vehicles, and everything else we're going to put in machinery and equipment. The other suggestion we would have for you here is, don't spend a bunch of time trying to get updated prices on machinery and equipment, particularly every year. When you do that first balance sheet, get some good prices on there, and essentially kind of stick with those as you do purchases and do sales. You'll have an idea of what you get, obviously, for both what you're spending and what you're getting on trade-ins. Record all of that, share that with us. That'll go on your balance sheet as well. And I guess, sorry, go ahead, Nick.
No, I was just gonna say, in addition to that is, every year we're gonna ask, did you buy any machinery and equipment? Did you sell any machinery and equipment? Same for vehicles, same for, breeding livestock, buildings improvements, real estate. As part of your record keeping, like we mentioned under current assets, keep a good running total of the stuff you bought and sold and the prices you paid for it. And if you put cash into those purchases, or maybe you paid 100% cash, or maybe you borrowed a little bit of money, through some dealer financing, keep good inventory of all that and provide it to your financial officer when you meet. Because again, that's all just good data that helps us put together the best statement we can for you.
And I truthfully, probably is the one thing that is the most critical when we're looking at year to year are those types of changes, those capital investment changes that you have, and capturing good records on that, because it really is a big impact. When we think about the dollar amounts that are generally associated with those capital investments, they're a big part of your operation.
Yep. Yeah, it's a big investment on your part. Let's make sure you get proper credit for it when we compile your statement.
Absolutely. Breeding livestock. So these are going to be the livestock animals that you're keeping around. And like Nick said, they're your factories. They're producing your widgets. Be sure to give your financial officers good records about if you had any purchases of new breeding livestock, because this is, again, just like all the other capital investments, is something that should be part of your balance sheet. Buildings and improvements, we like to see your grain bins, your pivots, tiling work, any types of outbuildings, finishing facilities, feedlot. All of those types of items is what would go into the building and improvement categories on your balance sheet. In contrast, real estate, we generally like to see either just bare ground prices. That would also be where your primary residence or any residence that you own would go in there. B&I would also capture buildings and improvements would also capture any types of like commercial structures you may own. So if you have another side business or if you have a rental property, those would also go into buildings and improvements. With real estate and buildings and improvements, I would give you kind of the same piece of advice that we talked about, but with machinery and equipment, is try to find good market values for that first balance sheet that you fill out. And then, only adjust those real estate values when you start to see changes in your real estate market. It may not be necessary to change them on an annual basis, or it may be depending on the area that you live in.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Don't try to guess the values of that stuff year to year. The more consistent you can leave it, again, it just helps your balance sheet trend from year to year be that much more accurate. I always like to tell people that I work with, on real estate, for example, we can put it at 1,000 an acre or 10,000 an acre. It really doesn't matter unless it's for sale. And a lot of times those assets down there under non-current, again, they're part of the factory. They're not something you're looking to turn. So, I'm comfortable with putting it at what I call a conservative market value for those assets.
Absolutely. And Nick's got a point, is when we start, that's another reason why we're so concerned about sales from those categories, is if you're, removing acres from production or removing livestock from production, is, how are we replacing that? So on the liability side, the current versus non-current, the definitions essentially stay the same. So accounts payable, we should be seeing things like if you have maybe bills for repairs, could be for feed expense, essentially those liabilities that really don't have a defined term, or that you don't have a loan on, that it's just a bill that you have coming due. Operating loans. So these are going to be your lines of credit. Maybe you have a budget note or a seed and chemical note. Those would be the operating loans. Outstanding drafts and checks. So this should be drafts and checks, typically against either your line of credit. Could also be that if you have written a check for another purchase, like Nick mentioned about telling us about checks that you're dropping off at the office when you come in, be sure to mention any checks that you have written out there that may not be reflected on your balances yet. So if you know that you've made a significant purchase and it isn't reflected yet, be sure to share that.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Kevin. Yeah, keep in mind too that, along those same lines, maybe you're showing an asset as a prepaid expense for some fertilizer, but the check or the draft you wrote for that fertilizer has not yet hit your line of credit or your account. Let us know about that so we can get the most accurate statement possible put together for you.
And it's kind of, it goes right with the name, balance sheet, is there should be a balance between these two things of assets and liabilities. And typically, if we're adding one, there should be something on the other side of this balance sheet that is going to bring us back to even. Credit card debt, I would say, is important in the sense that you need to let us have an idea of how much credit card debt you have. Even if you're revolving on that credit card debt where you're taking it out and paying it down, it's still important to share that information with us.
Yeah, and if you're if you have a line of credit with us and we're doing this balance sheet for renewal, or you're applying for a loan of some type, keep in mind, we're going to run a credit bureau pretty close to the date of the statement or the date we're doing the application. So if you have some, other loans out there that weren't reflected, or there's some credit card balance that wasn't reflected, just report it up front. We're going to ask you about it later. So if you can just, again, keep it out there, it just helps create the best statement for you.
For our non-current liabilities, so these are going to be those liabilities that were going to be on the balance sheet for more than 1 year. So term loans, typically term loans are going to be like your machinery and equipment loans, vehicle loans, could be breeding livestock loans. Generally, the type of loan usually goes with the life expectancy of the asset that was financed. So term loan is usually somewhere between 5 to 10 years in length. So, if we think about a real estate loan, typically is, anywhere from 5 to, 30 years in length. Is the lifespan of that real estate is way longer than lifespan of the vehicles or any of the equipment that we buy. So we're not going to be doing, a 30-year note on a piece of equipment. And typically we don't see a lot of 5 or less year real estate notes that people are requesting either. So if you're ever wondering about which category you should use or which one you should select, that's usually how we define those. Leases, I would say, is kind of a big one. Over the last couple of years, professional accountants have started reflecting more leases because in their industry they're required to now. Farm Credit's policy on this has always been to reflect all leases all the time. So if you have any leases on equipment or buildings, be sure to share those with us as well. And if you have a contract for deed, any contract for deed that you might have on ground, be sure to share those details with us, and that should be part of your balance sheet as well.
Yep. Again, just all the details you can share around those loans or those contracts or your leases. Let us know so we can get it set up correctly.
So we've basically covered what a kind of a generic basic balance sheet looks like. And it always seems so easy when we cover this. And yet I think when we sit down to do them, they feel a lot more difficult, or they're harder to do. But I'm just going to go back and say, I think a lot of it has to do with just that solid record keeping about what you're going to capture and what you're going to be putting on your balance sheets.
And I found if you take the time to create, a balance sheet the first time, and it's really, really accurate and it's really, really good, when you go to create one the following year, right, again, around that same time period, it's going to be so much easier the second go around because you have everything to reflect on that you did the previous year. So you'll kind of know, are the loan balances, reflect the payment off? Did you add any assets? Let's get those on there. Trust me, it'll be so much easier the next year. Just commit to getting the first one done correctly.
I would even share that even within Farm Credit, it's really no different. We try to put as much detail about your financials in that first year for the same purpose as every year that we deal with you after that. It just gets quicker and quicker, and it's easier for us to see the changes and what else is going on.
Kevin, anything you want to talk about that what does not go on a balance sheet?
Yeah, actually, household goods, I would say, would be the first one right off the top of my head. And that is, furniture, appliances. You might have a gun collection. You might have a stamp collection. Those types of things, wonderful to have. And obviously you do have an investment in them, but we don't put them on our balance sheets.
What would be the wildest thing you've seen? I mean, Kevin looks at millions of balance sheets a year. What's the wildest thing you've seen on a statement?
Oh, I don't know about wild, maybe unusual. I've seen Hot Wheels collections, Hot Wheel cars, GI Joes, Barbies, um, Confederate, or not Confederate, but Civil War uniforms. I've
Yeah.
seen that on a balance sheet before. All well and good, and it's really interesting to see, but unfortunately, we can't do much with those.
Exactly.
I would also maybe jewelry. Another one that you might have quite a bit of money invested in, but we can't help you with that. Uh, One thing we can take, though, is if you do have any kind of precious metals. So if you have an investment in gold or silver or something like that, if you would provide us the number of ounces that you have, we can give you value for that. We would ask that you not give us like the value of coins, because again, that's essentially a collectible. But we can give you commodity pricing on precious metals. So Nick, we actually have a couple of questions coming in.
Oh, good.
Should I be using my balance sheet to make purchasing decisions, or is it there a better tool to use?
That's a really good question. Um, I would say yes, you should use your balance sheet when making to use for purchasing decisions, mainly just to see, if it's a big investment, say like a piece of real estate. Well, what sort of impact does that real estate, both the asset and the liability, have on your balance sheet? Um, that would be probably the biggest example. And then just on other investments, what does it do? I mean, we haven't really touched on these ratios, but one ratio we look at is your liquidity or your working capital. What are these purchases? What sort of impact does it have on those ratios? That'd be stuff that if I was a producer, I would want to know the impact that potentially could have. And then, as Kevin went through the big three of statements that we use, you can take that information from your balance sheet and then plug it into your cash flow. What does that look like? Can you afford the annual payment, and what impact does it have on your balance sheet? So yeah, that's a really good question, and I would say the answer is both your balance sheet and your cash flow. Anything to add, Kev?
I would say I've been lucky enough to hear Nick and some other people at the office talk about this topic. And one of the things that I've heard them talk about that I would bring up here too is, when you start using these tools to make these types of decisions, it kind of gets you thinking about, okay, so if I spend this money on this asset, what does that asset bring back to my operation? Is this asset going to bring more income in? Is it going to help me produce those widgets that we've been talking about? Or is this just going to be an asset that is something maybe convenient or, that I want to have, as opposed to, what's it doing for my operation beyond being an asset and a liability on my balance sheet?
Yeah. Kevin, I might let you handle this one. Question came in. Do you revalue machinery yearly depending upon the market values?
No. I can't stress enough, no. Typically what we want to see is once you provide us a machinery and equipment list, we use our own depreciation values. And so we're going to depreciate that piece of equipment as long as you're showing it in your operation on a consistent basis year in, year out. You may recognize some gain from that if you're able to sell that piece of equipment for possibly more than what we're valuing it at. But think about it as that's just kind of bonus, that if you're able to do that, that's fantastic, and this also gives us an opportunity, Nick has kind of talked about this a little bit, is keeping the numbers reasonable on your balance sheet, because you're not hopefully in the market to be selling everything that's in that machinery and equipment list, so you're going to get the value in one form or another when the time comes for you to sell that piece of equipment. So I would just be patient on those.
Yep. I think just again the consistency. We'll definitely put it in there what you buy it for, but if you're holding it for year over year, let's just take a little depreciation off. Let's don't try to guess the market, because again, that just skews what the information's telling us.
So there's a great question here, Nick. So how do I know if my balance sheet is healthy, and will my officer tell me?
Yeah. Kevin used the analogy of using your balance sheet as your kind of your report from your doctor, and very, very true. And yes, we're not going real deep into this presentation, but we could go way deep into talking about the different ratios that we pull from a balance sheet and how they're important to you. And I guess what I'd tell you is, after you complete it and we've exhausted it and gone through it, and it's as accurate as we think we can get it, definitely if your officer doesn't do it for you, ask them. Tell them you want to go over it. You want to know what they're seeing. Maybe what are areas you could improve upon. Maybe do some goal setting for the from today to the next year of what parts of your balance sheet you want to improve. So definitely, if your officer doesn't willingly go through it with you on the spot, ask them for that feedback. That is what we're here for, and I think that's what separates us from other institutions. Is we'll go the extra mile with that information for you.
So Nick, I'm going to ask you another question on this too. Is, as an officer, do you think it's better if a customer can have their balance sheet completed and send it to you before they meet with you, or would you rather meet with them?
Yeah, I guess I would say get all the information together ahead of time. If you don't even put it, if you don't want to completely build it, that's fine, but bring all the necessary information so that can be constructed really quickly. And the reason I say that is then, if you're in the office for an hour, and it maybe if you bring all the information to the table and you're prepared with your purchases, your sales, your new loans, all your inventories, it might take 20 minutes to put that balance sheet together. And so then the next 40 minutes we can spend going through it and talking about how healthy is it? What improvements could you make? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? But if we got to take 50 minutes to build it and I got to ask you question after question to make sure we get it all, that doesn't leave a lot of time to actually return the value to you as the producer. And I don't know if now is a good time to get into it, but I would throw a challenge out there to everybody to, when you go to meet with your financial officer, either have your balance sheet built or have everything ready to build it, like I just talked about, and bring that to the office to meet with your officer. We're also going to be sending out a demo after the fact to your email that talks about what we call AgriPoint. So if you are a customer of Frontier Farm Credit or Farm Credit Services of America, you have access to balance sheets that Farm Credit's used, and you can actually build a statement on there. Again, you can use the data we already have and build your next year's statement. And there's a way you can share that with your financial officer. So I would challenge you all to get that information put together ahead of time and share with your officer as soon as you can. I think you're gonna see a big return on your time invested with the feedback and direction your officer provides you.
And you can translate some of that 20 minutes you otherwise would have spent building it with your officer to getting an extra 10, 15 minutes of time discussing financials instead of just building that balance sheet.
Exactly. Yeah, it's let's make the best use of that time, investing in your operation, not just putting this together because we have to.
I'd like to circle back to the original part of the question about whether my balance sheet was healthy. I would say, just from a credit standpoint, we get this question a lot, is, what's a good number for this or what's a good number for that? I always tell people, there is no magic number. Like there's no one thing that you're going to look at and know I'm okay or I'm not okay. I would say, don't get trapped into thinking that, there's just one ratio or there's this one number that we're looking at. We are looking at all kinds of things and we're looking at them together. And what might be good numbers for your neighbor may be bad numbers for you. And good numbers for you may be bad numbers for your neighbor. So I wouldn't get too wrapped up one way or another with that. This is part of that discussion you need to be having with your officer and really understanding your operation and your financials.
Yep, that's very, very true, Kevin. Another question come in. Let's talk about what's the biggest mistake you see when it comes to putting together a balance sheet? I'll give my 2 cents on that. Being a little too aggressive on some of your values of certain assets would be one. Again, I'd use that conservative market value. Because again, unless it's for sale, it doesn't matter, especially on your long-term asset side. And just probably the other thing I see a lot is just getting everything listed, both on the asset and the liability side. If you can capture it all at that time, I think in the long run you're gonna be better off.
Nick kind of stole mine, is that I would say the biggest mistake I see is just items not captured, that we had a purchase or we were reflecting the purchase, but we're not reflecting the liability that was associated with it. The other thing I would maybe suggest is consistency in what you call things from one balance sheet to the next, because we do occasionally see some customers who go from particularly like land. They might be using a legal description of the land one year, and then next year they call it Dad's tract or they call it Bob's tract. And we're not 100% sure whether that's the same thing or not. So consistency in filling those out as well, I think goes a long way.
Yep. Great advice there.
I like this question. How should I handle gifts and inheritance for my parents? So that is definitely something we need to know about, because it has typically a significant impact, usually in capital purchases, whether it's you were provided a gift of cash that maybe helped you make a purchase, or you were actually just given the asset to begin with.
Yep.
Something else to keep in mind with gifts and inheritance, I would say from the credit team side, a lot of times you may have to incur some additional taxes or liabilities as part of that inheritance. So be sure to capture those and share that information with us as well.
Yeah. I think even a common one to keep in mind is, you might be, maybe you're even offered a farm from your dad or grandpa. The farm is worth $100,000, but you only had to pay 50 for it. Let us know that the details behind that.
And vice versa, if you happen to be the one kind enough to give the gift, let us know that as well.
Yeah. There's 2 sides to it. Yep.
What about complex operations with other family members? Any advice you would give? So I will give you the advice my dad always gave me, was never go into business with your family, right? Mm-hmm. Isn't that what we always tell people? I would say you've got to be very open about those because it will have an impact on pretty much everything.
Yeah, and the big part there is, we all know, agriculture is a family business, and you're going to most likely be doing business with your family. But if you and your dad or you and your brother or whatever the situation is own an asset 50-50, put that on your financial statement. Case tractor 50% with dad, and then just list your value of that, your half. And same thing as if you guys are buying a tractor together, and maybe your dad or mom are using cash to buy it and you have to borrow, or if you're both taking out a loan, just make sure you reflect your portion of the loan, so we know that.
I'm going to throw out an example I actually had this week. Is we had a customer who does cattle feeding and didn't show any feed on their balance sheet. And it turns out that they're reflecting cattle on their balance sheet, but their family members are reflecting the feed. So that's a classic example of where, sometimes we get wires crossed about what we're showing and maybe what we're missing.
Yeah. Well, I think that's all the questions we've got. Those were fantastic. Thank you. Again, it shows you care. It shows your commitment to learning. I guess before we kick it back to Rebecca to officially wrap up, again, I just want to say thank you. And again, just keep in mind that challenge I threw out there. Really try to get your balance sheet prepared before even your financial officer asks for it. Really try to wow them and ask them to go over that balance sheet with you. It's going to pay dividends in the long run. The more you invest in understanding your balance sheet and your other financial tools, it'll pay dividends down the line. So that's what I'd close with. Kevin, you got anything?
I would say that, I think going forward, the thing that's going to separate operations is the understanding of the financial side of the business. I think production, is production, and most people understand the production side of the business, and the better grasp you get on the financial side, the better off you will be.
Thanks to Kevin and Nick for taking the time to share their expertise with us. And thank you in the audience. Really great questions. I encourage you to think about Nick's balance sheet challenge. And like he said, there'll be an email with some additional information on how you can use that AgriPoint tool to get an early jump start on that. So we hope you can join us again next month. Until then, take care, and we'll see you online soon.